There was also a significant political clash over Hamilton's aggressive use of the government to stimulate the economy. As Secretary of the Treasury under Washington, Hamilton proposed to increase the power of the federal government and its ability to regulate the economy. The first problem he faced was trying to deal with the massive debt left over from the Revolution. Hamilton was determined to restore confidence in the government by fully funding the debt at face value. Many people were outraged at Hamilton's plan, since most of this debt was now in the hands of wealthy speculators who had bought up the continental currency and bonds originally given to soldiers and ordinary citizens. Despite this opposition, Hamilton's funding plan passed Congress, with old worthless notes and bonds being exchanged for new interest-bearing government bonds. This not only helped restore confidence in the government, but also made the success of the national government a critical issue for much of the country's wealthiest elites, since they were now essentially stockholders in the national government. If the government failed, their bonds would become worthless. Hamilton further proposed and secured from Congress a measure to assume the revolutionary debts of the state governments. Having dealt with the problem of debt, Hamilton set forth a plan to create a national bank. He argued that one of the key problems facing the nation's economy was a lack of a reliable currency. In a simple subsistence economy, this was not a problem. Most economic transactions were local and face-to-face. People simply traded goods for other goods. However, once a true national economy began to emerge, this became impossible. Someone traveling from New York to Boston, for instance, could hardly be expected to shove a couple of spare chickens in his pocket to pay for lodging. Money was the essential lubricant to facilitate the shift from subsistence to a market-oriented or commercial economy. This was particularly a problem in the United States, since it was chronically short of hard currency in the form of gold or silver coins. State banks did issue paper currency, but the value of these bills varied wildly. Some banks were conservative and made sure their paper dollars were backed by sufficient reserves of gold and silver. But other banks were less cautious and overissued their notes. This made commerce difficult, since merchants might be paid in a variety of notes with varying values. Hamilton suggested that a central bank could help create a stable paper currency that would be accepted by people throughout the country, thus expanding the money supply. While it conceived of this bank primarily as a private institution, with 80% of the stockholders being private investors, the national government would bestow special privileges upon this bank, including the right to use the money collected by the government as a source of capital. In other words, they would hold the gold and silver of the national government and use it to issue paper currency and make loans. There were several key objections to Hamilton's plan. First, critics such as Thomas Jefferson argued that the national government simply didn't have the power to create such an institution. Jefferson and the emerging Democratic-Republican Party favored a limited interpretation of the Constitution. The national government could only exercise powers explicitly given to it in the Constitution. Nowhere in that document was anything said about creating a national bank. In contrast, Hamilton argued for a broader and more elastic interpretation. He suggested that the power to create the bank was an implied power, derived from Article I, Section 8 of the Constitution, which gave Congress the right to pass all legislation which was, quote, necessary and proper to exercise the powers enumerated to it in the Constitution, such as the power to coin and regulate the money supply. The second key objection was the fear that this institution, controlled largely by private interests, would give too much power over the nation's finances to a small clique of wealthy speculators. Ultimately, Hamilton won, and the first bank in the United States was chartered for a term of 20 years. Having secured victory in his plans to deal with the debt and establish a national bank, Hamilton tackled yet another economic issue. In 1791, he issued a report on manufacturing in the United States, which argued that the federal government needed to take strong steps to encourage domestic production. He suggested that the government should give direct subsidies to fledgling industries, and that it should protect these industries from overseas competition through a series of protective tariffs, taxes on imports. While Congress rejected his idea of directly subsidizing industry, they did begin to pass modest protective tariffs. These tariffs helped provide the money necessary to run the new and more powerful national government, but even more money was needed. At Hamilton's urging, Congress passed an excise tax on whiskey to help meet this need. This tax was greeted with outrage on the frontier. In the backcountry regions of the country, most settlers were still subsistence farmers. The difficulty and expense of moving large cargoes over primitive roads largely prevented them from engaging in commercial activities. However, they still did need some cash to buy goods they couldn't manufacture themselves. The common solution to this problem was to convert bulky crops like corn into whiskey, a highly portable and high-value item. This could more easily be transported and sold in distant markets. Hamilton's tax thus represented a direct blow to the interests of frontier farmers, and they soon organized to resist. Protesters harassed federal tax collectors, and in 1794 we see the development of a full-blown armed rebellion in western Pennsylvania. Washington moved decisively to squash this uprising by raising an army of over 10,000 men and personally leading it into the West. Faced with overwhelming force, the rebellion quietly faded away without a shot being fired. Under the administrations of George Washington and John Adams, the Federalists had moved decisively to utilize and even expand the powers granted to the new national government by the Constitution. They had successfully developed a strong foreign policy, helped open up the West for settlement, and aggressively moved to provide government support for a more market-oriented economy. At the same time, not all Americans supported their policies. This was also an era where we see the development of two distinct political parties with very different agendas. The Federalists generally favored the British in foreign affairs and emphasized the positive use of government to develop commerce and industry. They often also favored established elites and were at times very skeptical about the ability of ordinary Americans to rule themselves. The Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, were more inclined to favor revolutionary France and wanted a very limited use of the national government. Leaders like Jefferson were leery of creating an industrial economy like Britain's for fear that it would lead to inequality, with some people owning the factories and others simply working in them. They wanted a society based upon agriculture, where small farmers owned their own land and were economically and politically independent. Only in such a society, they argued, would a republic based upon egalitarianism truly survive. Unlike the Federalists, they are more inclined to believe in the ability of ordinary folk to rule their own lives. These philosophical differences would in many ways define the political debate in the United States for the next 2 centuries.